Could ask all of you to take a seat. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, welcome. About a month and a half ago, I started looking ahead to the teaching schedule and seeing what was going to come up in the chronological Bible during the couple weeks that I was going to have the privilege of teaching. And of course, being in the New Testament now and going through the Gospels, there's a lot of really good information that we can share. Examples from the life of Christ and his relationship with his followers. It's just rich with great teaching material. But I started to hone in on what we're going to cover today and next week, John chapter 10, because as I was thinking back, I think this is honestly a chapter of Scripture that I've never taught on before. And so as I was reading through that and preparing, I got to tell you how much of a huge blessing it was to me. And so I'm hoping that it will have that same effect for you and in your walk with Christ, that it will just be a huge blessing to see what the Apostle John has to share with us this morning and again next Sunday. So just by way of explanation, if you have a bulletin in front of you, I want you to know that when we get about halfway through today's bulletin, in terms of the outline for the sermon, we're going to be done. The intention is not to cover all of the outline today. This is a 2-week outline, so you can take some notes today if you like. You can bring it back with you next week. I know one of you in the whole church will do that. Probably Ann Postlethwaite. Or you can just pick up a fresh copy next Sunday. That'll be okay too. So one outline for 2 weeks and one primary point for the next 2 weeks as well. And we'll get into that in just a minute here. I got to turn around and look at this. Okay. Where's Jenna? Where's Jenna? Can you see it? All right. So, all right, let me pull back the curtain here. So behind the scenes, when I was putting the PowerPoint together, I spent way too much time trying to get that New Life butterfly down here in the corner. I mean, we're talking hours. So, does it look good? All right, thank you. Yeah. If you knew how long it really took, you'd be embarrassed for both of us. Okay. So as I mentioned, our primary point will only be half of a point today. But let me share that with you. Primary point is this, that Jesus is the door and the good shepherd. This is what we're really going to talk about this morning. Jesus being the door and the good shepherd. Jesus knows you, the Father knows you, and you are safe. Before we get into all of that and dive into John chapter 10, I just want to talk about John the Apostle for a few minutes. You know, as you remember reading back through the Old Testament, particularly when we got to the books of Kings and Chronicles, right? 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles. If you did what I did, you sort of like skimmed one and read the other really thoroughly. Do you remember why? Nikki, you're shaking your head. Do you remember why? No, you're just shaking your head. All right. That's okay. The reason why is because throughout both of those books, we're seeing parallel examples of the same stories. So as you read through Kings, so Solomon through the rest of the nation of Israel's history as far as it relates to their kings, that information is there. And then it's also in Chronicles. And the accounts, as you might expect, read almost word for word the same. In fact, if they didn't, you might be confused, like, well, how come the Bible isn't matching up here and here? So, truthfully, like I only read one of those and not both of those at a time. But that was interesting about the Old Testament, seeing that some of those stories were repeated. Now, as we've gotten into the New Testament and reading through the Gospels, you've seen something kind of similar, right? So we see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all taking their own perspective, guided by the Holy Spirit, and telling us what Jesus' ministry looked like and how they associated with Jesus. At least the two disciples that were traveling with Jesus on a consistent basis, Matthew and John. And so as you've been reading through the chronological Bible, you've seen that we get to certain days, and you might have 2 or 3 accounts of the same thing that was happening in Jesus' life. In fact, about 2 weeks ago, on October 7th, you might remember that you were reading about Jesus healing a demon-possessed man. That was recorded in Mark chapter 5. On the same day, Matthew chapter 8, Jesus healing a demon-possessed man. On the same day, Luke chapter 8, Jesus healing a demon-possessed man. Not 3 different healings, right? Not 3 different people, but simply different accounts of the same thing that was taking place. Now, what did we read from John about Jesus healing the demon-possessed man? Do you remember? That's the right answer. Silence. Nothing. John doesn't talk about Jesus healing the demon-possessed man. In fact, then on the next day of reading, we read about Jesus going into the city of Nazareth and preaching in his hometown. Mark tells that story. Matthew tells that story. We read it on the same day. What does John say about that? That's right. Nothing. John doesn't say anything about that either. So here's what I'm getting at. As we go through the chronological Bible and we read the Gospels, what we see is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke often provide 1 or 2 or 3 accounts of the same thing that was taking place in Jesus' life. And from John, we hear nothing about many of these stories, as if John were taking a nap or something. Who knows what John was off doing? Well, we actually do know what John was doing, and we are fortunate that John gives us his remarks, his interpretation, his remembrance of what Jesus' ministry was all about. John gives us a unique perspective that the other Gospels do not. One thing that's unique about the perspective that John gives us is John is considered most likely to be the last living apostle. And most of John's writing likely took place towards the very end of his life. John is credited with having written 5 books in the New Testament, the Gospel of John, so right towards the beginning, the book of Revelation, slotted right towards the end, and then the letters of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, so those 5. John probably wrote the manuscripts for all of these pretty late in his life, almost near the turn of the century, between the 1st and 2nd centuries after Christ died. And so, because John wrote late in his life, the other Gospels were already likely circulating in the communities that had a church. And so John had the ability to read and to hear what the apostles had already written ahead of him, what Matthew's account already was. For the disciples of Mark and Luke, what they have already recorded in their stories about Jesus' life. If John had access to that, then we might surmise that one of the reasons why John wrote his book the way that he did was because he wanted to tell us things that the other writers of New Testament books didn't tell us. And so for that, we get a unique perspective from John. Secondly, John refers to himself throughout the book of John as the disciple whom Jesus loved. John actually never puts his own name in his own gospel. Have you noticed that as you've started reading through the book of John? We don't really see John's name in the Gospel of John, but he does refer to himself as the disciple who Jesus loved. It sort of begs the question, well, didn't Jesus love all of his disciples? Well, of course he did. But I find it interesting that John chose to give this description of how he felt about his relationship with Jesus. It's a little weird that he refers to himself in the third person like that, and it might even sound arrogant in some ways for John to say that I am the disciple who Jesus loved. But nevertheless, John does have this perspective about his relationship with Christ. And so as we read through John's book, it is helpful to us to remember and to understand this type of relationship that John had with Christ. Third, another part of John's unique perspective is that, of course, John was an eyewitness to everything that he writes about. The Gospel of Mark is not named as one of the apostles that Jesus chose. And so as Mark records the story of Jesus' ministry, Mark is likely to have received much of that information from other sources, probably from talking to other disciples and the apostles as he recorded Jesus' life. Luke, the same way. Luke may have traveled with Jesus some, but Luke was not called to be one of those original apostles. And so as Luke is recording dialogue from Jesus' life, particularly dialogue between Jesus and the apostles, well, where did that come from? Luke probably interviewed some other sources to be able to write that down. But we know Matthew and John were there. And John in particular, we know, was with Jesus nearly everywhere all the time. John was one of those three that was part of Jesus' inner circle, the disciples among the disciples, those that were very close to him. We see, for example, that Peter, James, and John had the privilege of going up with Jesus on the mountain and seeing the body of Christ transfigured. That was an event that only those three men got to see. And so John was there to see everything that Jesus did in ministry. And the personal account that we receive from John helps us to know that John, seeing these things with his own eyes, hearing these things with his own ears, and being guided by the Holy Spirit as he wrote the story of Jesus' life, we can know that what John is saying to us is true. It's accurate. It's trustworthy. And that's helpful as we use John's words to evaluate Jesus' relationship with his disciples, and today our relationship with Christ and what we can learn through that. Finally, I very much appreciate the way that John ends his book. So we haven't gotten there yet in the chronological, that's a hard word sometimes, chronological Bible. So spoiler alert, let's jump to the end of John. Here's how the way John ends his book. He says, "These are written," so these words that I've recorded, "these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him you will have life by the power of his name." John is really the only gospel writer that is as specific as he is about the purpose of his book. What does John say? I'm writing these things so that you will know, you will believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. I so much appreciate that that's important to John. And so as we continue to read through the Gospel of John, I would just encourage us to keep that at the very forefront of our minds. Why was this written? Why was it written then? And why do we get to read it now? Because John wants us to know who Jesus is. Not just as a man, but as the Son of God. And so those are some perspectives that we get from John that I appreciate as we read through his book. Today we're going to cover John chapter 10, specifically verses 1 through 21. We're going to see four themes that are going to play out in our teaching this morning. The first is Jesus' description of himself as the door and the good shepherd. So he's going to use both of those analogies. We'll look at those. We'll talk about the relationship between the good shepherd and his sheep. We'll talk about how there is one flock with one shepherd. And finally, if we get this far this morning, we'll talk about the shepherd being an obedient volunteer. Best thing about having one outline for 2 weeks is if we don't get done, we'll just pick up where we leave off. So, let's start reading the text together. John chapter 10, verses 1 through 6. I'll be reading out of the New Living Translation. I tell you the truth. This is Jesus speaking. I tell you the truth. Anyone who sneaks over the wall of the sheepfold rather than through the gate must surely be a thief and a robber. But the one who enters through the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep recognize his voice and come to him. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. After he has gathered his own flock, he walks ahead of them, and they follow him because they know his voice. They won't follow a stranger. They will run from him because they don't know his voice. Again, John chapter 10, verses 1 through 6. Now, let's step aside from the passage for a moment. I just want you to picture something in your mind with me, okay? Imagine that you're not here at New Life Community Church on this Sunday morning, but rather it's a Sunday morning around 31 AD. And you are in the midst of making a decision with your spouse and your kids about what you're going to do on Sunday morning. and you decide, hey, we got a whole day free, we got nothing to do. Let's go to the town center. We hear that there's this guy named Jesus that's coming through town. We've heard about all these things that he's doing all over the place that sound kind of fascinating. Let's just go check him out and see what he's all about. We have to remember that the people that John was writing to don't have all the context that we have, right? We know what Jesus was doing there. We know what Jesus taught. And we can see, because we have all of the gospel accounts, we can see the totality of what Jesus' ministry was all about. But if we can take ourselves backwards to this time, and we're getting up on Sunday morning wondering what we're going to do, well, maybe we'll go see Jesus. Now, if you'd heard a little bit about Jesus before he came to your community, what might you be expecting? What might you be hoping for? Little audience participation. What might you be hoping for? Seeing some miracles. What kind of miracles? Food. I mean, that would be the best one, right? Let's not even pack a lunch. Jesus will take care of that one for us, right? Or maybe I've been sick all of my life, and my hope and expectation is, well, I heard that Jesus did that over there. Maybe Jesus can do that for me, right? Jesus, in many ways, was a traveling spectacle. And so if we're deciding what we're going to do for entertainment on Sunday, let's go see what Jesus might be up to. So Jesus is in town. Maybe he'll do a miracle. Maybe he has some interesting words to share. Maybe somebody will get arrested. Who knows what's going to happen? But let's go track him down. And then you get to the event. You get to the event and you hear Jesus say what we just read. Let's go through that again. I tell you the truth, anyone who sneaks over the wall of the sheepfold rather than through the gate must surely be a thief and a robber. But the one who enters through the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. Does that meet your expectation? Well, guess what? John tells us to the extent that this met the people's expectations who had traveled to go see Jesus. What does John say right after this? John says, those who heard Jesus use this illustration didn't understand what he meant. So Jesus explained it to them. Now, sometimes when we read through these stories in the Bible and Jesus is speaking in parables, we see Jesus say things like, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Or we see Jesus knowing that there's a certain segment of that crowd that is listening to him, but he knows they don't understand what he says. And there's another segment of the crowd whose ears have been opened, and they do understand what Jesus is trying to communicate. We see other examples of that. What does John record here in John 10? It would appear that nobody really understood what Jesus was talking about. That'd be kind of a bummer. I got up early. I didn't even eat breakfast because I thought maybe Jesus had the food all ready for me. And I go out and listen to this guy that I've heard these stories about, and I hear this portion of his message, and I have no idea what he's talking about. I'm just standing there dumbfounded because what Jesus is saying isn't making any sense. So, of course, Jesus knows this about his audience. He goes on, verse 7. John says that Jesus now goes back and he re-explains the story in some different language. Jesus says, I tell you the truth, I am the gate for the sheep. I am the gate for the sheep. It begs a couple of questions. First of all, what is a gate? And who is the I am and who are the sheep, right? Well, again, we have to put ourselves in the time and place of Jesus' teaching. We, those of us who have been in the church for a while, maybe have heard teachings about Christ, can hear this language, and we know where Jesus might be going here, don't we? We know that Jesus uses this language of the shepherd and the sheep and the gate and the pasture. And we know this because we've read it before. But you know what? Up to this point in time, John chapter 10, do you know how many other times Jesus has referenced himself as being the shepherd and his people as the sheep? It's a nice round number. None. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, up to this point in time, have no language, none, about shepherd and sheep. And so you see, as Jesus is talking to this crowd that already doesn't understand what he's talking about, he's now using an analogy about himself that he's never used before. I tell you the truth, I am the gate for the sheep. Let's talk about the gate. When I was a kid, I lived right in this neighborhood over here on 7th Street. And so if you go down 29th Avenue towards Lindmar, you'll pass my old house that I grew up in. It's right on the corner. It's a brown house, kind of a light brown house. In the backyard, there's a fence, like many backyards, that separate our yard from the neighbor's yard. And when I was a little kid, my brother and I would go in the backyard a lot and throw any kind of ball that was available. Some of them safe, some of them not so safe for backyard usage. Inevitably, those balls would go over the fence. Now, all of our children went to Sunday school. Parents, you can answer this question, or those of you who are older now that remember your childhood, you can answer this question. When you throw the ball over the fence, you're usually faced with a couple of options. You can walk the long way around and find the gate that's right next to your neighbor's house, which is right outside their back window where you know that they can see you going through the gate. Or you can kind of do one of these jobs, hop the fence, grab the ball, take it back, right? Everybody's smiling. You know exactly what I'm talking about. What do you think I did? Hop the fence every time, right? I'm not going around to the gate. Now, why did I check to my left and to my right before I did that? I knew hopping the fence wasn't the right thing to do. I didn't care, but I knew it wasn't the right thing to do. As Jesus is telling this story about how he is the gate, it reminded me of my childhood and hopping over the fence. You see, what Jesus is going to describe here is that if you are the sheep and you're looking for the pasture, there's only one way to get to it, and it's not hopping the fence. You got to go through the gate. There's only one legitimate way to accomplish what Jesus is going to describe here, and that's to go through the gate. And Jesus says as plainly as he can now in verse 7, I am the gate for the sheep. Now, in a minute, he's going to talk about some thieves and some robbers, and we're going to come back to the bad guys in just a minute. Let's go on to verse 9, John 10:9. Jesus continues and says, those who come in through me will be saved. They will come and go freely and will find good pastures. So, what is Jesus saying about himself here? Those who come in through me will be saved. Well, saved from what, Jesus? Saved from who? Why are we saved? And why are you the only way that we can be saved? It's an incredible statement what Jesus appears to begin to say about himself. And again, we have to understand, I keep going back to this because it's important. We have to understand that Jesus has never said this before. You have to imagine that this is the very first time that you've heard Jesus talk about shepherd and sheep and gates and pastures. It's never come up in his ministry. And so now Jesus says, if you come through me, those who do will be saved, and you will come and go freely, and you'll find a good pasture. Now Jesus goes on then in John 10:10. We start to get to the bad guys. The thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. My purpose is to give them, the sheep, a rich and satisfying life. Who is the thief? Again, if we've been in church for a while, we know who Jesus is talking about. But those people don't know who Jesus is talking about. So it's really probably not very clear yet as Jesus is sharing this story about who he's protecting people from, who the thief really is. Now, there are some other bad guys that we're going to read about in the story here in a little bit, and we'll see what the bad guys do. They steal, kill, and destroy. But Jesus says, what kind of life do I provide? I provide a rich and satisfying life. And so we see here in summary that Jesus is saying, I am the door. I am the gate for the sheep. Now, for those who have ears to hear, Jesus has just declared himself to be the one and only path to being saved. Again, unique language that people never would have heard before. Not only the only path to salvation, but the path to a rich and satisfying life. Now, that would have been pretty appealing to everybody that was in the audience. Because the door or the gate is the only legitimate passageway, Jesus is saying that if you're trying to have a rich and satisfying life any other way, it's not legitimate. You have to go through this gate. You cannot hop the fence. And Jesus is going to describe for a moment what it looks like to hop the fence. As Jesus has said, some people are going to try to sneak in by jumping the fence, but that's not going to work. It's not going to work. Now Jesus goes on in the next verse, verse 11, and makes the first statement that he's ever made that sounds like this. He says, I am the good shepherd. Now, if Jesus has your attention in that crowd, if Jesus has your attention in this crowd right here, Jesus has just fired a shot. Jesus has just said something that's pretty intimidating and has a lot of audacity. I am the good shepherd. Now, again, the language in the New Testament would have been brand new. But if you're a Jewish person, if you're a person of God from the nation of Israel and you're there listening to Jesus, and we know that's who his crowd is. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay? If you're one of those people, well, have you heard some language before about sheep and shepherds? Yes, you have. Not from Jesus in what we call the New Testament today, but you've heard that in the Old Testament. You grew up learning about the law and the prophets. And so you now began to hear something coming from Jesus' mouth that sounds familiar but different. Let me show you what I mean by that. We'll go back through some readings from our chronological Bible. In Genesis chapter 48, so towards the end of the book of Genesis, this is when Jacob is about ready to die, and so he's now giving his blessing to Joseph. And he says to Joseph, Joseph, God has been my shepherd all of my life to this very day. That's way back in Genesis that we first see a description about the Father God being a shepherd to his people. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 2, Samuel writes, in the past when Saul was our king, you, David, were the one who really led the forces of Israel. And the Lord told you, David, you will be the shepherd of my people Israel. You will be Israel's leader. Here's a third example, the most well-known of these three. What does David write in Psalm chapter 23, the 23rd Psalm? The Lord is my shepherd. In the Old Testament, there are about 30 references to there being a relationship between a shepherd and sheep. And in these examples, in every case, the shepherd is either God or God's appointed leader of his people. Now, Jesus comes along in John chapter 10, and what does Jesus say? I'm the shepherd. What is Jesus inferring by that statement? If you have the ears of an Israelite, Jesus just said that he's either God or that he's God's appointed leader of his people. One of those two things. Can you imagine being in the crowd and hearing that for the first time? That's exactly what Jesus is communicating here. I am the good shepherd. And then Jesus goes on to tell us why that's significant. Jesus says, continuing in verse 11, the good shepherd sacrifices his life for his sheep. In the New American Standard Version, the phrase, is lays down his life, if that is more familiar to you. The Greek word there is tatimi, and that means a variety of words as translated throughout the New Testament. Here are some examples of how that word is translated. It might mean to place or to lay or to set or to put, commit, or appoint. So as you think about all those words, what are they pointing towards? Jesus is saying, my life has been put down for the benefit of the sheep. I am your good shepherd. In the Old Testament, what we knew that meant, as we see the writers of the Old Testament describe the shepherd and the sheep, is that the shepherd would fight any battle for the sheep. The shepherd would do anything for the sheep that he needed to. He might even die for the sheep. And now Jesus has said, I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd sacrifices his life for the sheep. I will do anything that is necessary for you. It's an amazing statement said for the first time right here. Well, then Jesus goes on and he contrasts what the good shepherd is versus others. In verse 12, John writes, a hired hand will run when he sees a wolf coming. He will abandon his sheep because they don't belong to him and he isn't their shepherd. And so the wolves attack them and scatter the flock. The hired hand runs away because he's working only for the money and doesn't really care about the sheep. Now we're circling back around to the bad guys. There's some bad guys in the story. Here, Jesus talks about the bad guys being the hired hands and wolves. Earlier, Jesus talked about the thief. So the thief is now the wolf in the story. We're not going to spend a lot of time today focusing on the bad guys, because really the emphasis that I want to have today and next week is on the good guy, the good shepherd. But the bad guys, the thieves and the wolves, are here in the story, and the hired hands are here in the story. What is Jesus communicating about these people? Allegorically, what is Jesus saying? They don't care about you. They don't care about you. They might be looking to give you a message of hope. They might be trying to help you. But in the end, these are hired hands. And when things get tough, they're gone. And these are wolves. And these are thieves. And what are they really looking to do? Kill you. Destroy you. Make your life absolutely nothing. Now, who are the people that Jesus is talking about? Who are the hired hands? Most commentators believe that the hired hands that Jesus is referencing, and I believe this to be true as well, would have been the religious leaders of the day. The men of the nation of Israel, responsible for the spiritual life of the nation of Israel. Men whose appearance was often more important than what was really going on inside. Pastor Ben talked last week about the cup, right? The inside and the outside. What's clean, what's dirty? What do we see, what don't we see? The religious leaders sure look good on the outside. They look clean. Inside, a mess. And so Jesus is talking here about those religious leaders, the hired hands. They're just going to run. When they see real trouble coming, they're just going to run. They're going to abandon you. They're not here for you. But I'm the good shepherd. I'm the good shepherd. He continues in verses 14 and 15 and repeats that same phrase, I am the good shepherd. And then Jesus adds additional context. I know my sheep, and they know me, just as my Father knows me, and I know the Father. And so I sacrifice my life for the sheep. You see here that Jesus adds a few more points of emphasis. He again says, I am the good shepherd, and I know who my sheep are, and they know who I am. And just as my Father knows me, and I know him, that's the kind of relationship that I have with my sheep. You see, Jesus is now taking another step of audacity and saying, me and God, we're one. We know each other. We know each other intimately. We know everything about each other. He knows me, and I know him. And then Jesus is using that same terminology to describe the relationship that he wants to have with the sheep. I want to know the sheep just like my Father knows me and I know him. Not only I want to, what does Jesus really say? I do. I do know my sheep that way, and my sheep know me that way. Jesus is describing his relationship with the sheep at the same level of intimacy that Jesus is describing his own relationship with his dad. A relationship that in John chapter 10, in front of this crowd of people, would have sounded absolutely crazy. Now, as Jesus is talking about this, just as my Father knows me and I know him, and talking about the intimacy of that relationship, it may be obvious to us that Jesus has just said that God is his dad, but it may not have been very obvious to this crowd. You see, the story's unfolding, literally phrase by phrase, as Jesus is sharing it here. The light bulb is warming up, right? It's changing color. It's flickering, and it's going to come on here soon. The first 15 verses of John chapter 10, did you know that they're not written to you? They're not written to you. Because Jesus then goes on to say, I have other sheep too. I have other sheep too that are not in this sheepfold. So I mentioned earlier, we know the context of who Jesus is speaking to. Even if we didn't know the history of Jesus' ministry, we don't have to guess now. We know Jesus is speaking specifically to a particular kind of lamb. He's talking to God's chosen lambs, to a very specific audience. But then Jesus changes the nature of the story, and he says, there are some other sheep, and they aren't you. They are not in this crowd right here. They're not in this sheepfold. And Jesus says, I need to bring them in also. They will listen to my voice, and there will be one flock with one shepherd. How long had the nation of Israel been God's chosen people up until this point in time? 2,500 years? For more than 2,000 years, the only thing that God's people had ever heard is, you're mine, and that's it. Nobody else is mine. Nobody else is mine. I don't have a covenantal relationship with anybody else. And Jesus, this wacko who just told us that God is his dad, now says, there are some others. You aren't the only ones that are going to be in my sheepfold. Amazing, amazing statement. And then Jesus continues with the amazing statements and says, and I'm going to be that one shepherd for this flock and for that flock. There's going to be more sheep, and they're going to hear my voice, and they're going to come to me. Finally, in verses 17 and 18, Jesus describes his relationship with the Father and the authority that Jesus has over his own life. He says, the Father loves me because I sacrificed my life so I may take it back again. No one can take my life from me. I sacrifice it voluntarily. By the way, again, what a bummer of a story if you got up on Sunday morning to go listen to Jesus hoping you were going to get fed. I sacrifice my life so I can take it back up again and no one can take it from me. I sacrifice it voluntarily, for I have the authority to lay it down when I want to and also to take it up again, for this is what my Father has commanded. Jesus is now foreshadowing something that is to come. We know that. They don't know that. But Jesus reminds them and us of something that's super important. Jesus was a willing participant in everything that was going to happen. In some ways, this was preordained by God. God the Father knew what the plan of salvation was going to be for you and I today, for those sheep that were outside the sheepfold and for the ones that were inside the sheepfold. So, in one regard, this was planned out. But in another regard, Jesus tells us here, and I got to admit this is a little mysterious, God knew what was going to happen. God had ordained that that was going to happen, but then Jesus says, hey, wait a minute. Wait a minute. The Father has commanded that I have the authority to lay my life down. And what else? To pick it back up. Jesus is saying here, I'm going to have the authority to die. And I'm going to have the authority to be resurrected. God is giving that to me. That's in fact what he has commanded. And so we see that, don't we, in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is praying before he's arrested. What does Jesus say to his dad? Let me paraphrase. If I have to do this, I will. But is there any other way that we can get this done? And although we don't hear a verbal answer from God in the garden, what must we assume? The answer was no. That was the only way that was going to get done. That sacrifice had to be made for all kinds of sheep, including you and I today. That's what God had commanded. And that's why we say that the shepherd is an obedient volunteer. Jesus didn't have to do anything that he didn't want to do. Jesus did it because he was obedient to his dad. He volunteered to be the good shepherd. Finally, at the end of this part of the story, we see exactly what we might imagine to see. Verse 19. When Jesus said these things, the people were again divided in their opinions about Jesus. Some said, he's demon-possessed and out of his mind. Why listen to a man like that? I'm guessing that was like 90% of the crowd. I mean, we don't know, but others said, this doesn't sound like a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? And it just reminds me that it is not much different today, is it? When people come across the story of Jesus, the Messiah, who is he? Is he the demon-possessed, crazy man out of his mind who makes no sense, who isn't who he said it is, and I'm not going to listen to that because it makes no sense whatsoever? Or is Jesus the man who must not be possessed, because how could he do what he said he did? How can we have these eyewitness reports of what he did if he was that crazy man, if he wasn't the good shepherd, the Son of God? Our primary point this morning is that Jesus is the door and he is the good shepherd, and he knows you, and the Father knows you. And next week we're going to talk more about how that is. How does the Father know you? And how can you know you're safe? I know that will be encouraging. How can we know we are safe? So the question I want to end with today is this question right here. Do you believe that Jesus is the door? Is that what you believe? Is Jesus the gate to that good, perfect, and pleasing pasture? Is he the good shepherd of your life? Does he know you? And do you know him? When you hear his voice, do you know it's him? Today, the invitation is to acknowledge that Jesus is the door and he is the good shepherd. And he will do exactly what he said he would do. He'll lay down his life for you. In fact, he already did. He already laid down his life for you. So as we get ready to sing a closing song here, I just want to encourage you to consider where you're at with Christ. Is he your good shepherd? Is he not? Is he a crazy man? Or is he this guy that did amazing things that couldn't be explained any other way than him being the good shepherd and the Son of God? Take a moment, if you would, to speak with somebody next to you or just to pray and ask God to help you understand who he is. And then we'll finish in song here in a moment.